There is something they have only recently begun to understand about you, and the realization is affecting them far more deeply than they expected. For a long time, they believed they understood why you became distant. They interpreted your silence as a sign that you no longer cared. They convinced themselves that your absence meant the connection had lost its importance and that every step you took away from the situation was simply evidence that you had moved on. But now, they are beginning to realize that the truth was much more complicated. What they once saw as indifference was actually a decision that required an incredible amount of strength. The surprising part is that they never expected to see it that way. They had become comfortable with the story they created about you. It was easier to believe that you stopped caring than to consider that you might have been carrying deep emotions while deliberately choosing not to express them. It was easier to label your silence as weakness than to acknowledge that it may have been an act of extraordinary self-control. But something has recently changed in the way they see you. They are beginning to understand that not everyone responds to pain by creating more pain. Not everyone seeks revenge when they are wounded. Some people simply walk away because they realize that protecting their peace is more valuable than winning a conflict that will only create additional damage. Think of it as standing beside a fire while having every opportunity to throw more fuel into the flames, yet choosing instead to step away and allow the fire to eventually burn itself out. That is what your distance is beginning to represent to them. They are finally realizing that your silence was never surrender. It was never proof that you had nothing left to say. It was a deliberate decision made by someone who understood that not every conflict deserves an answer. And as this realization settles into their mind, they are beginning to see your strength differently. For a long time, they assumed that anyone who had been genuinely hurt would eventually fight back. They believed pain naturally produced anger, and anger naturally demanded an outlet. In their minds, anyone dealing with betrayal, disappointment, confusion, or emotional loss would eventually search for a way to make the other person experience the same suffering. That is precisely why your response has become so difficult for them to comprehend. The more they revisit everything that happened between you, the more they recognize that you had countless reasons to retaliate, yet you chose not to. You had opportunities that many people would have taken immediately. You knew things that could have changed the way others perceived them. You knew what happened behind closed doors. You remembered the moments that made you question yourself. You knew about the promises that were never kept, the explanations that never came, and the actions that slowly created distance where closeness had once existed. Yet, despite carrying all of that, you made a decision that now stands out more than anything else. At the time, they probably did not recognize what you were doing. They may even have mistaken your restraint for weakness. Perhaps they assumed you remained quiet because you lacked confidence, feared confrontation, or simply had nothing meaningful to say. Now they are beginning to understand that silence can require much more strength than anger ever does. Anyone can react impulsively when they are hurting. Anyone can allow intense emotions to take control and say or do something that cannot later be taken back. The real challenge is standing in the middle of disappointment and refusing to allow that disappointment to determine the person you become. That was the path you chose. There were moments when you could have revealed everything, even though no one else realized it. You could have told your side of the story in a way that would have earned sympathy. You could have explained every detail that caused you pain. You could have publicly identified the actions responsible for the wounds you were carrying. Many people would have supported that decision. They might have called it justice. They might have said you were simply defending yourself. They might have insisted that the other person deserved to experience the consequences of what they had done. But somewhere within you, there was a deeper realization. You understood that revenge can provide temporary satisfaction while creating lasting emotional damage. You recognized that allowing bitterness to consume you would only keep you emotionally attached to the very experience you were trying to leave behind. Imagine carrying a heavy stone for miles and finally reaching a place where you have the opportunity to put it down. Most people might feel tempted to throw that stone back at the person who gave it to them. You chose something different. You released it. You refused to carry it any farther. You refused to turn it into a weapon. You chose to keep moving without requiring someone else to suffer before you could heal. That is the decision they are finally beginning to understand. It was never about pretending they did nothing wrong. It was never about excusing their behavior or allowing them to escape accountability. It was about refusing to let your pain turn you into someone you did not want to become. As they look back now, they are beginning to realize that your distance was never intended as punishment. It was not some secret strategy designed to manipulate them, make them feel guilty, or force them to chase after you. Your distance was a boundary. It was your way of protecting parts of yourself that had already endured more than enough. Instead of spending your energy proving how deeply you had been hurt, you redirected that energy toward rebuilding yourself. Instead of seeking revenge, you concentrated on recovering. Instead of allowing your entire life to revolve around what happened, you gradually began creating a future that was no longer controlled by the past. And that realization is changing everything about the way they perceive you. The person they once believed they understood is slowly disappearing from their perspective. In that person's place, they are beginning to see someone far stronger than they ever imagined. They are seeing someone who could have chosen destruction but chose dignity. Someone who could have spread anger but chose peace. Someone who could have exposed every wound for everyone to see but instead chose to heal privately. Perhaps what affects them most is realizing that you made this choice when doing the opposite would have been much easier. They are finally beginning to understand that your silence was not empty. Your absence was not meaningless. Your distance was not proof that you stopped caring. It was proof that you cared enough about your future to refuse becoming trapped in an endless cycle of resentment. While others might have expected retaliation, you chose growth. While others might have chosen conflict, you chose peace. And as this realization continues to settle within them, they are beginning to see that your distance was never evidence of weakness. It was one of the clearest demonstrations of strength they had ever witnessed, even though they were too distracted to recognize it at the time. But what affects them most is not simply realizing that you chose distance instead of revenge. It is understanding what that distance was concealing. For a long time, they only noticed the visible outcome. They saw you become quieter. They watched you stop explaining yourself. They noticed you gradually withdraw your energy from situations that once mattered deeply to you. What they never saw was everything happening beneath the surface. They never witnessed the emotional weight you carried when no one else was around. They never saw the questions that remained in your mind long after conversations had ended. They never experienced the moments when you desperately tried to make sense of things that no longer seemed to make sense. Because they never witnessed those private struggles, they assumed your silence meant you were unaffected. Now they are beginning to realize how wrong they were. There were battles you fought that nobody else ever knew existed. While everyone around you continued with their lives, you were quietly trying to understand experiences that left permanent marks on you. You may have replayed certain conversations repeatedly, wondering whether you had overlooked something. You may have searched for explanations that simply did not exist. You may even have questioned your own judgment, your own value, and your understanding of everything that had happened. Yet, through all of it, you rarely allowed the outside world to see just how deeply you were affected. You learned to smile while carrying disappointment. You learned to function while carrying uncertainty. You learned to keep moving even when a part of you was still trying to process everything that had already happened. Imagine someone watching a building from the outside. The structure appears stable. The walls are standing. The windows remain intact. Everything looks perfectly normal. What that person cannot see is what is happening within those walls. They cannot see the cracks being repaired, the weakened areas being reinforced, or the countless hours of work required to keep the structure standing. That may be the best way to describe your healing. From the outside, people assumed you were doing perfectly fine. They saw you continuing with your life and believed you had been unaffected. But internally, you were doing the difficult and often invisible work of rebuilding parts of yourself that had been seriously damaged. And now they are beginning to realize that your silence was never proof that you felt nothing. It was often proof that you had already felt too much. One of the most difficult things for them to accept is understanding just how much of your healing happened without anyone beside you. There were probably times when you wanted explanations. There were moments when you wished someone would acknowledge what you had experienced. Maybe there were times when you desperately hoped someone would notice what you were carrying and simply ask what was wrong. But those moments often passed without the understanding you were waiting for. Eventually, you learned to give yourself what you were not receiving from others. Instead of waiting for someone else to provide clarity, you began finding your own answers. Instead of depending on outside validation, you learned to trust what you had experienced. And instead of waiting for someone else to recognize your pain, you gradually learned to acknowledge it yourself. That is why your distance looks so different to them now. At one point, they interpreted your withdrawal as rejection. They assumed your silence meant you had become indifferent. They saw your absence and concluded that the connection must no longer matter to you. Now they are beginning to understand that your distance may have been necessary for your emotional survival. Every step away was part of your recovery. Every boundary was an attempt to protect yourself. Every period of silence created breathing room between you and something that had become too emotionally overwhelming. What makes this realization so significant is that they are finally seeing the difference between what they assumed was happening and what was actually happening. While they thought you were forgetting, you were healing. While they thought you were becoming cold, you were learning to be more cautious. While they believed you were simply moving forward without looking back, you were quietly learning how to live with experiences that had affected you far more deeply than anyone realized. And perhaps the hardest truth for them to accept is knowing that they judged your silence without understanding the pain that produced it. Now, when they look back, pieces of the past begin to connect. The distance they once questioned. The silence they misunderstood. The boundaries they took personally. The changes in your behavior that once confused them. All of these things begin telling a completely different story. It was never simply the story of someone who stopped caring. It was the story of someone who cared deeply and eventually realized that healing required distance. As that realization becomes clearer, they are forced to confront something they never expected. They were watching your silence all along, but they never understood the strength required to carry what you were carrying while continuing to move forward. And this is where their perception of you begins to change. At first, they simply recognized that you chose distance instead of retaliation. Then they began to understand that pain was behind that decision. Now they are beginning to appreciate just how much strength it required. The more they revisit what happened, the harder it becomes for them to view you through the same perspective they once had. They expected anger. They expected resentment. They expected bitterness. They expected you to react in a way that would have seemed completely understandable given everything you had experienced. Instead, they encountered something very different. They saw someone who chose recovery instead of destruction. Someone who refused to make pain the foundation of their identity. Someone who quietly removed themselves rather than creating another cycle of damage. And that reality is becoming increasingly difficult for them to dismiss. The truth is that revenge is usually easier than genuine growth. Revenge can provide an immediate emotional release. It can create a temporary feeling of control. It can even convince someone that causing another person pain will somehow make their own wounds hurt less. But you were never interested in a temporary victory. You wanted something more lasting. You wanted peace. While other people might have spent their energy trying to prove they were right, you used yours to rebuild your life. While others might have searched for opportunities to expose every mistake, you searched for a way forward. That decision may have gone unnoticed at first, but now its meaning is becoming much clearer. When they look back, they begin remembering the moments they once overlooked. They remember situations where you could have spoken badly about them but chose not to. They remember moments when you could have intensified the conflict but remained composed. They remember opportunities when you could have made their lives considerably more difficult. Yet you resisted. At the time, they may have interpreted your silence as a lack of interest. They may have assumed you simply did not care enough to respond. Now they are beginning to understand that your restraint came from something very different. It came from wisdom. You understood that not every argument deserves your attention. Not every provocation deserves a response. Not every wound requires you to fight back. Sometimes strength means recognizing that engaging with something will only keep you connected to it. Imagine standing in front of a mirror after surviving one of the most difficult periods of your life. You could look at yourself and become consumed by everything that happened. You could remain trapped in old anger, replaying old battles and allowing resentment to become part of your identity. Or you could choose another path. You could become someone who learned from the experience without allowing the experience to define you. Someone who became wiser instead of bitter. Someone who became stronger instead of harder. Someone who understood the lesson without remaining imprisoned by the chapter. Every choice you made pushed you closer to that second version of yourself. You were never trying to prove to anyone that you were strong. You were simply trying to protect the person you wanted to become. And perhaps that was your greatest demonstration of strength. You refused to let your circumstances dictate your character. What surprises them most now is realizing that your distance was never designed to make them suffer. The more they understand your choices, the clearer it becomes that your attention was not centered on them. You were focused on yourself. You were focused on healing. You were focused on building a healthier future. You were focused on finding peace in circumstances where peace initially seemed impossible. That realization changes the entire meaning of your actions. They are no longer seeing someone who simply walked away. They are beginning to see someone who outgrew the need for revenge. And with every piece of the story they finally understand, their respect for you grows. Not because you were flawless. Not because you never felt anger. Not because the experience failed to hurt you. Their respect grows because they are beginning to understand what real strength actually looks like. Strength does not mean you never experience pain. Strength is the decision you make after pain enters your life. You had reasons to become bitter, but you chose wisdom. You had reasons to hold on to resentment, but you chose healing. You had reasons to remain trapped in the past, but you chose to continue moving forward.